So one could go on and on and on about how to make the transition, but that's not really what this book is about. But I did try to give at least a few concrete examples of things that can happen right now that are completely possible, that don't require John Boehner waking up with a completely different worldview. So on that happy note, I will wrap it up and take your questions. Thank you.
There's a lot of money and jobs tied to development in, quote unquote, the global south.
Mm-hmm.
So in your research, were there particular programs that you found that were international relief and development or development projects that were working and or undermining efforts by farmers, etc.?
Well, actually, Caritas was supporting those Brazilian farmers I mentioned. And I hate to be a buzzkill, but it's my nature, or it's my job. But yeah, I mean, actually, the international aid industry is pretty messed up. And there's a great book about it called The Crisis Caravan by a Dutch journalist, a woman, I can't remember her name, Polan, I think, or anyway, starts with a P. But I mean, her, it resonates with what I've seen in failed states and war zones. And I mean, her argument is that the kind of market model in the aid industry of like all of these groups competing for contracts from government aid, DFID, the British version of USAID, NORAID, the Scandinavian aid money, all of that works through, for the most part, these large NGOs. And they're in competition with each other for contracting. And that creates some pretty irrational behavior. And again, I return to this theme of planning. This veneration of market mechanisms is not good. It's necessary to regulate and plan even the aid industry. And one of her prime examples in that book is Rwanda. And it's appalling when you actually read the history of how the Hutu genocideros who were driven out of Rwanda by the RPF then take up positions in the DRC, in Democratic Republic of Congo. And the aid agencies, because they're jockeying for these contracts and they've got these people, they've got this infrastructure, they have to get the next contract, and at the headquarters, the fact of the matter is they are very competitive with each other. On the ground, it's not like that. On the ground, people work together. But, in Geneva and Brussels, they're like, jockeying for contracts. And so the Hutus, Interhuame, the militias, were able to for years, play these aid agencies off of each other. And there were a couple times when one or two of them said, this is outrageous. We're not going to feed a bunch of soldiers who at night go back into Rwanda and kill civilians. And, then the news was like, well, then somebody else is going to get the multi-million-dollar contract to provide the latrines or the grain or the this or that to that camp, if that's your position. And so they successfully played these groups off against each other, and they had this infrastructure from the aid agencies supporting them for several years until Paul Kagame said enough was enough and very brutally on his part started shelling the camps. It was like, that's it, we're coming in, we're invading the DRC and we're going to shell these camps and we're going to drive everyone out. And that's what they did, and that's how it got shut down. So that's just a very disheartening story, but aid agencies do a lot of good work, but they also, I think, don't get kind of the harsh light of critical reflection shown on them, so I share that with you. That's harsh, I'm sorry. But they also, I'm not saying you shouldn't support NGOs or work with them at all, but that just, we should not be naive about the problems in the major aid industries. And the magazine I write for, The Nation, an excellent journalist, Canadian journalist, Isabel McDonald, just broke a story about the Clinton Foundation, which is essentially the de facto government in Haiti, right? Haiti's become the republic of NGOs. They had put out a big tender for hurricane-proof shelters. Well, it turns out it was a no-bid contract to the same firm that built all those contaminated FEMA trailers in New Orleans. So this is the problem with putting too much emphasis on aid from the North, when really what has to happen is states in the global South have to build their capacity. They have to become more accountable to their people. And the reason that has to happen is because governments are more accountable than private NGOs. I mean, to this day, the Clinton Foundation has yet to provide any proof of how they chose this firm. And that's a kind of a typical example. And one of the long-term unintended consequences of the aid industry is to just undermine state capacity. And throughout the Global South, you find that. I was just in Pakistan, and when the Pakistani government really wants anything done, it's contracted out to Western research firms. And the government itself, the bureaucracy, has been allowed to just become a collection of sinecures and bribe-taking, time-serving parasites. And really what it needs to be is a functioning bureaucracy that can provide irrigation and plan and confront things like this massive flood.
So just to balance it out a little bit, can you give us any example of witnessing an example of international aid where there's been a good understanding of the interplay and intersection of all of these different themes and the geopolitics and the history and a way to develop sustainable policies?
The Heifer Project is one that I've seen. It's generally the smaller ones that are about working with really grassroots forms of economic development and aiding specific communities around providing appropriate technology. And even some of the large NGOs, like Caritas is a large NGO, large Catholic NGO. But as I was saying, on the ground, people do really good stuff frequently. And the people on the ground in Brazil, in the northeast of Brazil, Caritas, are, work very closely with the MST and try and support them in their brief is not to seize private property by any means, but they work with these groups when they're, helping them adapt these appropriate technologies. So there are examples like that, despite my harsh criticism. But.
Does your book cover the melting of the polar caps, and do we have to worry that Iceland is about to attack Canada or violence and those types of things?
Yeah, I mean, I do briefly in that, that's one of the most dangerous positive feedback loops, of course having negative consequences, of how climate change can become self-fueling, and this is already happening. If the permafrost melts, methane is released. Methane is a very intense greenhouse gas, at least 20 times more powerful than CO2. So if the great methane belch from the permafrost is really unleashed, then there's very little we can do to intervene and change that. I deal with the whole question of the melting of the Arctic and the jockeying for resources briefly because I don't think that is going to be the main source of conflict, and that's been dealt with a lot in newspaper reports, and other people like Gwen Dyer dealt with it in his book. And that whole model strikes me as really insane, that people think, oh, there'll be an ice-free Arctic and then there'll be an oil rush to the ice-free Arctic. Well, if there's really an ice-free Arctic, there's also going to be very sudden and massive sea level rises, maybe not immediately, but within several decades. So the entire infrastructure that is presumed by an oil rush is going to be threatened. So I don't see like an ice-free Arctic leading to the kinds of interstate resource conflicts that are normally described, because I think ports like San Francisco and refineries like the Chevron refinery in Richmond are going to be flooded, and there's going to be internal crisis in places that's going to preclude that mineral resource rush.
So students and grassroots solutions.
Organizing is key. I mean, the one thing I would say is that I think collective organizing, building institutions and movements is very important, much more important than buying greener products. This is not a problem that can be dealt with through individual habits, but we have to come together. And I think that the fight against coal is something that Greenpeace and Sierra Club have been involved in, along with local organizations in Appalachia, like the Ohio Valley Environmental Coalition, have been very successful in using a combination of direct action and legal tactics and messaging and political pressure to shut down coal plants. I think over 100 proposed coal plants have been scrapped because of this pressure. So I think that's actually a very important thing for people to get involved in. And now there's this fight about tar sands in Canada, which are filthy, and they're profitable, and they're going to be developed as long as oil stays above $85 a barrel. And one of the ways that they're going to make it to a world market is with a pipeline through the U.S. So there's a big fight developing to prevent that pipeline so as to thwart and, essentially, legally monkey wrench the development of the tar sands in Canada.
In his research, did he come across the taboo topic of population growth and the impact?
This is my position on it. I think that when there's a potentially racist, Malthusian argument about population control that needs to be critiqued and militated against, but there is also a kind of naive overreaction, I think, by some on the left, to say that population isn't an issue at all. And really, there's a progressive argument to be made around population, which is that it's the empowerment of women, right? When women have education and legal rights and economic opportunities and control over their bodies, then population growth rates stabilize. And that's something that should be at the center of development agendas, and it's something that has been pushed to the side, family planning and women's rights. It's been pushed to the side because of the religious right in this country in terms of how it fits into the role of U.S. aid. But the fundamental thing to keep in mind, of course, I was at another event in Portland, somebody asked, what's the carrying capacity, the human carrying capacity of the planet? And I said, well, it depends on how many of them are millionaires flying around in private jets, doesn't it? So we have to remember that it's like the main problem with resource use is a small minority of the world population that is over-consuming. That's the argument that sometimes is used to dodge the issue completely. Food First made great arguments in the early 80s about how the world could sustain twice as many people if we were all vegetarians. And therefore, the issue is not population, it is redistribution and social justice. And that's true, but at the same time, populations, the combination of rising standards of living and population growth is really putting serious pressure on ecosystems. And so, I mean, the Chinese one-child policy, very draconian, but it's ridiculous to say that they shouldn't have attempted that, in my opinion. Have the way they've done it, has it been brutal? Yes, but I mean, read the history of China. The famine in the 70s, serious crisis. They had to deal with it to some extent. So I hope that's sort of clear. It's kind of a cutting it down the middle. I mean, I think population is an issue. I think there's a progressive response to it. I think we need to maintain a critique of the right-wing response to it, and we also need to always reassert that the real, much more important issue, rather than the number of people, is the consumption habits of a small minority in the richest economies who use vastly more resources than people like Ekaru Lorman, who died owning 50 goats, a machine gun, and a shawl and a pair of sandals.